works on a very interesting phenomenon, which are the agents of globalization, essentially. Lawyers. And he works on lawyers in China, India, and Brazil. Now, if BRIC dialogue is going to mean anything, it's going to have a lot of sense, not only between social scientists, but amongst other professions, obviously starting with translators, but lawyers and engineers and others are the actual agents of dialogue. So I'll hand you over to Fábio.
Well, thank you, Tom. Hi, everyone. So, as Tom said, I'm working on a network of researchers. I'm working with the network of researchers who are trying to assess the role of law and lawyers in governance across these BRIC countries. I'm going to say some more at the end of the presentation. But I would like to start this talk with this quote from Brandeis, historic figure of the US legal profession. This is part of a speech that he gave in 1905. And basically what he says here, I'm not going to read this for the sake of time, but basically what he says here is that, you know, though we may not like the idea, as countries develop, conflict increases, right? We've seen this in some of the previous presentations. So he talks here about the fact that the industrial world is in a state of ferment, clearly talking about the conflict between workers and industries. And what he also says here is that, you know, and even if we don't like the idea either, in modern societies, law, lawyers, and legal institutions are important resources, institutional resources, for the mediation of these conflicts. And why we can say that? Because lawyers and legal institutions allow public participation in processes of decision making and constitute an arena in which change can be brought about through regular rules of the game. And so no wonder the rule of law has become an indicator of political development. So there's plenty of literature that talks about this. Here are some of the main lines of inquiry that people have worked with. So work on lawyers, work on courts, work on law and social movements, work on new constitutionalism, and work on rule of law. We can see that throughout ANPOCS meeting and other meetings of social scientists. And in all these cases, these people are documenting, explaining, and to some degree reinforcing the importance of law and legal institutions in governance. If we move beyond the academia and go to international organizations, we can see here too, you know, the work for the World Bank, rule of law and regulatory quality is once again an indicator of development. And even on the streets, if we go to the streets, so this is something that happened here in Brazil recently. People are quite aware about this, but we had people protesting for better public services, against corruption, whatever. And then in Rio, we had this law that the state house passed prohibiting people from using masks because some people who were using masks were supposedly causing trouble. And what did protesters do? Well, they protested again, obviously, but they also took legal measures. You know, people went to courts, and the bar said that it's unconstitutional. So this is again an evidence that law is a mediator in these kinds of conflicts that rise, you know, as societies develop and increasing complexity. However, I argue, law, lawyers, and legal institutions do not naturally and univocally become part of this policy or governance repertoire. Instead, there are structural factors that, you know, shape people's ability to invoke and mobilize the law in order to produce policy change. So scholars have crafted this concept of legal opportunity structure to refer to such factors. And some examples in the literature are, you know, the available legal stock. So if you don't have a legal doctrine that, or rights in the Constitution that allow you to invoke the law, so it becomes harder, right? So these are some, there are several studies that are, you know, documenting and explaining these factors. So in some ways I build on this literature, but I subject it to a methodological review. So what I do is I incorporate Bourdieusian perspective and analyze the legal opportunity structure as a field. In other words, I acknowledge that structure matters, but I consider that structure itself is socially constructed. So I understand that the legal opportunity structure is a product of political disputes among participants in the field who try to shape the field in accordance to their own interests. And on the basis of that perspective, I undertake a social historic analysis of what I call the institutional organizations, organization of access to justice and legal mobilization in Brazil. So, I mean, I'll just give an overview of what I have discussed in the paper, but so first, and I was trying to connect with the panel, the summary of the panel, which, for example, pushed us to discuss the role of law, the role of the state, market, and civil society, right? So I looked at state agencies, civil society groups, and even the legal profession, and how in each of these domains people have mobilized the law, and what are the institutional arenas within which they have done so. So I look at the Ministério Público, the Defensoria Pública, or prosecutors, public defenders in Brazil, more indigenous traditions in the civil society, such as advogados populares, or people's lawyers, and student-led legal services to community and social movements, which are actually quite strong and radical traditions. So I look at the profession and I find that there is some tradition of engagement with access to justice by grand liberal lawyers, that happens throughout the Brazilian history. But also there is some level of vigilance with respect to the corporatist interests of lawyers. And I'm talking here about the state and bar financial agreements that take place in São Paulo, in which so the state pays private lawyers to defend the poor in court cases, and that obviously become a factor of something that benefits private lawyers and then make them quite cautious about any change that might take place here. They were even against the Defensoria Pública because they thought that this was going to steal their clientele. And we're talking about countries that have been very much exposed to globalization and foreign traditions, especially the U.S. influence. So I found some evidence of that, in the context of institutionalization of pro bono work in law firms, law school clinics, and litigation-oriented NGOs. In other words, what I do throughout the paper is to provide evidence that we have a very diversified system in terms of institutions, practices, and ideologies. That all of that amounts to the what you call the legal opportunity structure in Brazil. And those institutions, they conflict, cooperate, and struggle for legitimacy. Very much in line with the Bourdieusian perspective. And in light of that, we have, I argue that we have more than an opportunity in the law, as the title of Brandeis' speech, but we actually have several opportunities for the law in the current context of Brazil. These opportunities are going to be shaped by the relationships that these actors come to develop and establish, and the impact of these recent imports, right? So here's an example, the case of pro bono in Brazil. So we had this pro bono movement, primarily constituted by people who have connections with the U.S. institutions, Ford Foundation, Open Society. So when they tried to bring pro bono to Brazil, they had to build alliance, right? So they reached, obviously, these modern corporate law firms, which had the interest in participating in the foreign market, so it was good for them to adopt pro bono. But they also had to rely on the traditional legal elites, the liberal lawyers, who could provide some legitimacy for this idea of institutionalizing pro bono in law firms in São Paulo. Anyway, what happened was that the bar opposed this because they were afraid that this was going to hinder the market for legal services for the poor that was established with the state bar financial agreements. So the bar was very hostile to the idea of pro bono. So what ended up happening was that these people had to make a partnership with even more politicized groups, like public defenders, advocacy groups, and NGOs. So here there's a trend to radicalization of the pro bono movement, and we've seen them filing amicus curiae in the Brazilian Supreme Court on behalf of minority groups. So what was originally sought to be, an attempt to actually almost privatize legal assistance for the poor, ended up being something that flirts with a more radical approach to legal mobilization. And so and here's another example of how this interplays can take place. And when we look at these litigation-oriented NGOs like Conectas, Human Rights, or Terra de Direitos, so we see that they have these court-oriented strategies, very much in line with the US tradition, right? On the basis of constitutional principles and international human rights covenants. But when they tried to institutionalize this, they also had to make these partnerships with, again, the liberal legal elite, but also with these people's lawyers, right? Occasionally, they also cooperate with Ministério Público and Defensoria, but not always. So they have had considerable impact in the legal opportunity structure in Brazil, but actually, generally, they have a much less radical and socially embedded approach to legal mobilization than Advocacia Popular. So we've seen the rise of these organizations, but we've seen also the demise of a more politicized approach to legal mobilization. And we've seen